Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Raising Healthy Mothers. Today, I am excited to welcome Sally Rickard, lactation consultant, onto the show to talk about breastfeeding and returning to work. Welcome, Sally.
Thanks very much.
So let's start with just learning a little bit more about you, your story, and how you came to become a lactation consultant.
Yes, I've always done a lot of baby and child focused things in my life. My sister and I were monopolizing the babysitting uh, business in our home village in Sussex Villages since we were like 11. And then I spent some time training in childcare, and I worked as a nanny for years. I was working as a nanny when I had my first son, and I just kept working as a nanny and took him to work with me. And so when I had my first son, I had some problems with breastfeeding. And I also just found the more I learned about breastfeeding, I just found it so interesting and all the science behind it and everything. I trained to become a breastfeeding counsellor with the Breastfeeding Network and volunteered in Lambeth and in St Thomas's Hospital. And I just got more and more into it, did more and more training. And I did the exam. I studied for the exam during the pandemic and then did the exam. So I've been running my own private practice for a while. And I guess that my background as a nanny meant that I was really familiar with working with families where the mums have to go back to quite busy jobs quite early on in their careers. I guess as well as working in the children's centres and the hospital and so on, and running my breastfeeding cafe, meet like families of all different backgrounds. But seeing that like ongoing, how it turns out when people return to work when they're breastfeeding or have to go back to study before they're ready, and how that affects the family long term.
Yeah, interesting. And we're going to get really into that in this episode. But let's start with as well talking about because your specific acronym is IBCLC. What
Yes,
is that? What does that mean? And why
I
is
know,
it the
it's
gold
super
standard?
annoying. No desperate parent anywhere is Googling IBCLC. So it's International Board Certified Lactation Consultant, which is globally recognized the highest qualification in breastfeeding. And so it's very niche. And even, I mean, many people that do it are midwives or health visitors, but I actually don't have a medical background. I came to it from the breastfeeding counselling and peer support angle. So yeah, you have to, it's really complicated. Lots of people ask me how to study to be one, and it's just this like complete mess of small courses that you have to like piece together yourself. And there is a 4-hour exam as well.
Wow.
But actually, the really one of the most valuable bits of the training is that you have to log 1,000 hours of helping families face to face. And that's super valuable, you know, just like all the variety that you see and the different situations that you come across.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I'm a breastfeeding supporter and looked into the full IBCLC qualification, but I stumbled at I don't know how to do this. I need someone
No,
to tell me what
it's
to do.
really unclear.
Yeah, and then the 1,000 hours it's a lot of hours, which you've kind of got to do either on top of your current job or like alongside somehow. So it is, and I guess that is why it is the gold standard, because you certify at a point when you have seen an awful lot of breastfeeding mums before you've even kind of got that qualification.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the really valuable bit. There's only so much you can learn from books, isn't it? It's like physically helping people and seeing the different situations.
Mhm.
That's where real value is. And of course, following the outcomes, which is useful when if you work in the community or you have a breastfeeding cafe or something, I don't know if you do, but you see the same families like ongoing sometimes and see how things turn out or don't turn out, or whether they were interested to take on your advice or whether they've chosen a different path. It's very good for your learning.
Yeah, yes. And I love that idea as well of being able to follow them through, like, maybe up to a few years or second, third babies, and
Yeah,
knowing like that is such a huge impact that you'd be having.
I love it.
Um,
It's very good for my own, what's the word? I was going to say personal development, I mean professional development, to
yeah,
actually see the outcomes.
yeah, amazing. So I brought you on specifically to talk about returning to work as a breastfeeding mother, but because that's sort of one of your areas of specialty. But before we go into that, why would it even be a consideration? Like, why would a mum even want to continue breastfeeding, say beyond 6 months or a year? And why would they need to think about preparing for that before they go back to work?
So I think, well, in the UK, we have quite bad breastfeeding rates, don't we? I know there's people listening to your podcast from other countries. It's quite rare in the UK to be breastfeeding at 6 months or a year. And I think that almost means that people need more support or more information, because it's not just generally assumed that you would do that. Though we always say it, the World Health Organization recommends breastfeeding for 2 years and beyond. And there is real value in it. I think it's quite commonly thought that it's just for comfort, or there's no nutritional value or something. But actually, breastfeeding, as your baby grows and becomes a crawler and then a toddler and a preschooler, the breast milk just becomes more and more concentrated, and it gets more immunity factors in it, and the recipe just like slightly tweaks to suit them better and better. So thinking about it, especially if you're using like a childcare setting, your baby or child is just starting to begin to get out in the world and crawl around and put stuff in their mouth and come into contact with a lot more children. So the immunity value is really, there's something there. It's proven that breastfeeding families have half as many one-day absences from work for parents, obviously, or from daycare. So there's a value there. And I guess another consideration is that it's a lovely way to connect when you've been apart for the first time. It's obviously, we know in parenting generally that you don't want to change too many things at once. You've got to choose your battles, haven't you? So, it's like moving them into their own room or something. You've got to do these things carefully and time it nicely. So maybe if you are going to start being separated and you are going to start using a new childcare provider or something, that's a lovely time to just keep that continuous, so that they have that way to reconnect with you guys when you're back together again in the evening, maybe.
Yeah. And I really resonate with that, in the sense of like that connection, that reconnection after being away, like, because it's like an unspoken connection. You don't have to talk or do anything, because that closeness is there, isn't it? You're having a cuddle, and it's kind of yeah, it's a
Yeah.
lovely way to unwind as a mum as well, I think, as well, that kind of coming, it's almost like a bit of a slow transition back into family life from work. It's like a bit of a yeah, I think that's I really
Yeah, and you get that,
identify with that.
yes, you get that comfort and the reconnection. You're going to be getting a immunity feedback happening from
Mm.
whatever their germs are from childcare, or
Yeah.
whatever they've been doing that day, whatever environment they've been in. A lovely way to reconnect, and I guess good for mothers' hormones as well, because stopping breastfeeding can bring a bit of a hormonal dip. So that's
Mm.
something that you might want to, once again, it's about timing and picking your battles, isn't it? You don't want to go into that at the same time as going back to work, at the same time as being separated for the first time.
Yeah, that would be full on. And yeah, definitely want to talk a little bit about that kind of hormonal factor, emotional kind of factor as well. But let's talk a bit about what are your rights as a breastfeeding mother in the workplace. What does the UK law say about it?
Not much. It's interesting. In the UK, I think I'm correct in saying, up to date, that in the UK there isn't anything actually clearly written in law about breastfeeding or pumping in the workplace, and breastfeeding or pumping breaks and flexibility and so on. So you've basically got to take other pieces of law and use them to cover the area of breastfeeding. But it is valid and it has worked in the past. So there's other laws, such as the right to protection against indirect, let me say it correctly. You have the right to protection against indirect sexual discrimination. You have the right to privacy in a place of rest. You have a right to health and safety, and you have a right to flexible working. And all these things can be sort of made to fit your needs as a breastfeeding parent. In the past, it happened to EasyJet that 2 staff members took them to tribunal, and won, because they'd asked to do groundwork instead of long shifts or flights while they were breastfeeding. And they did win. And it was basically because they had letters from their GP saying they'd be at risk of mastitis if they weren't able to do groundwork. And the difference was that EasyJet had allowed them to do it for 6 months, but the tribunal came away with the result that they should be allowed, as long as they want to continue breastfeeding, they should be allowed that flexibility. And
Wow.
one of my clients was telling me actually on Monday, I did our return to work group on Monday, one of my clients was telling me that she works for a trade union and they had won a case where a teacher had been asked to pump in her car instead of being given a suitable place in her workspace, and she had won as well.
I'm a bit flabbergasted by that.
I know. There's something new though. There's new guidance from the Health and Safety Executive just maybe 6 months ago or a year ago. And I don't think that's exactly law, but it is new guidance. And now what it says is that if you put in writing to your employer that you are either pregnant or breastfeeding, they're obliged to proactively invite you in and ask you if you need any adaptations. Or if there's anything they can do to help you feel safer in the workplace. And that's really interesting because I find that one of the barriers is that it's a kind of slightly awkward and personal subject for some people.
Yeah.
It depends really, doesn't it, on like, what is your workplace atmosphere? How well do you know your boss? Is your boss male or female? Are they a parent or not a parent? And some people just would really struggle to go in and say, right, there's the thing I need about my breasts because they're getting really hot and full and I'm going to have to blah, blah, blah. And it just, some of my bodily fluids are going to be in the communal fridge. And it's just weird for some people. You and I know it shouldn't be weird and we should be able to feel confident talking about these things. But I think that new guidance pushes their responsibility to their employer, which is great.
Which is great, yeah, because one of the questions was actually going to be, well, looking at it from the employer's point of view, what can they do to make it easy? And I suppose that obligation or guidance to start up the conversation.
Yeah, it's true. And I wrote a dissertation about this when I was training for my IBCLC. I had to choose a topic for a dissertation, and my dissertation was about how can employers better support breastfeeding families and why should they, like the economic argument. And there's lots of different research. Unfortunately, a lot of it's American, which doesn't, it's largely skewed to shorter maternity leaves, although things are changing everywhere. And it's got like these few key themes that come up again and again. And one of them is definitely like supportive workplace atmosphere and flexible hours, on-site childcare. Although that was written before the pandemic, I think that's another layer of complication now, isn't it? Because so many people are hybrid working. So yeah, there was quite a few key points. There was a load of information from the annual NCT survey, and a lot of it was just parents saying that they would have liked to ask, but they didn't feel confident to. So that sort of proactive workplace atmosphere is really important, and education of and it pays off, if they support the families.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you brought up America as well, because I know I've heard it before where they say, if you want to learn more about how to express when you're going back to work, ask an American mom, because they've had to do it sometimes from like 6 weeks. And the breastfeeding rates in the US are actually better than the UK, which is so surprising given
I was really surprised to hear that when I first started my breastfeeding training. I was very surprised by that. I hadn't realised that the rates are so bad in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. And so it is interesting to know that actually if a lot of the research has come out of the US in that kind of supportive atmosphere. And I guess
and it's sort of in law in the US as well.
Okay, yeah.
But I think there's other reasons too, because they have slightly different rules about what can be in formula. So some would say that American formula is less good quality and poorer value. Plus, because of health insurance, a lot of people get a good quality pump through their health insurance. And yes, they have better breastfeeding rates and much shorter maternity leaves. And all these things are all tied together, I think, to make a different, it's a different situation.
Yeah, definitely.
But I find that since the pandemic, and just generally maybe because people have portfolio careers and often run their own, like you and I, like running their own small companies and so on, and a lot of hybrid working, I actually meet a lot of mums that are going back to work much earlier than you would think.
Mm.
I think that the fact that you can work from home and you can do odd bits and bobs of hours, if you were working 9 to 5 and going to an office and paying for a childcare, you would not be going back to work at 2 months and 3 months and 4 months. But people are starting to do that now.
That's interesting. And I guess coupled with the fact that the cost of living is so much more expensive, the kind of maternity pay, so statutory maternity pay certainly isn't enough, but
No,
even what you might get from your employer, especially kind of once you get beyond the 9 months part where
yeah,
it's unpaid, I can completely see that. And I think I've seen that in people I've spoken to and friends as well who have returned to work potentially a little sooner than, either with their first child or than they had expected. So that's really interesting. That you've noticed that pattern.
yeah,
um
it's a bit of a shame. I feel a bit conflicted about it because I think it's great that people can work flexibly and work in the evenings and pick up little bits of this and that and do 2 days a week for one business and 1 day a week working for themselves. And so that's lovely. But it does kind of devalue the parental leave period and that sort of connection between mother and child and the
yeah,
quality time together and a chance to, reset and recover and bond and so on. It gets a
yeah,
bit devalued by the return to work being so early or so like
yeah. And it's
very.
hard, isn't it? Because I mean, I don't know about you, but it feels like the conflict there for me is like, is that anti-feminist to say that, oh,
I
yeah, but you
know.
should be staying at home and being you being mom and and it's
Yeah,
like, what's the balance there? And I guess it's very personal, isn't it? Like some people will have a strong feeling that they need to go back to work because that's such an important part of their identity and feel suffocated maybe by being mother full time. But yeah, I mean, and it is, what's the message from society there, isn't it? Like,
I
because
know.
mothers are so undervalued as it is.
Yeah, what would be ideal, obviously, is that if everybody feels supported and given the opportunity to do it however they do want.
Mm,
But we know it works the other way as well, that some mums would like to have a year or 2 years or more off and then be able to
yeah,
go back to where they started rather than going back 3 days a week and being given really like junior work compared to what they ever used to be, or
yeah,
having
yeah,
felt like they've been demoted or got out the loop, or
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
shame.
And it's, yeah, anyway, it's hard because it's hard. You can see it from the employer's point of view, and as I said, from an economic point of view, that is all in the kind of government's interest to get people back to work as soon as possible.
Yeah,
So, I wanted to ask about expressing and pumping because we kind of touched a bit about that on the fact that in the US, they said mums tend to be
yeah.
very kind of on it with that. I mean, is it absolutely necessary if a mum wants to continue breastfeeding and they've returned to work?
So probably not, but it does depend on the age. And two of the questions that you said wants to continue breastfeeding. So that's also an element of it. If you want to can maintain your breastfeeding at the same rate that you're currently doing, that's a different question from
Mm,
if you want to keep some breastfeeding in the day or in the picture, but you're happy to gently move away from breastfeeding or over time or cut down your breastfeeding. So there's lots of different options. There's a load of information in this about the course I do, where I do like sessions for mums in my breastfeeding cafe and online sessions and one-to-one sessions. And there's a real deep dive in there about all these different maths and technicalities of how often and how much you
mm,
might need to pump. But I'll do you a little TLDR version, which is that many mothers find that once their baby's about 9 months, 10 months, 11 months, depending how much of a keen eater they are, then many mothers find that they don't need to pump at work and they can probably just breastfeed when they're with their child, even if it's like 2 or 3 days a week and then 4 days a week or whatever, like a mix. You can probably just breastfeed full time when you're together and get away with not pumping at work and or maybe just doing the minimum, like going and like doing a little massage into a vessel in order to relieve the pressure or something like that. And I think a lot of people are pleased to hear that, because it's very easy to just go down a total rabbit hole trying to work out how you're going to manage. And the idea of taking your pumping equipment in and carrying a chilly bag of milk home just becomes a bit of a logistical nightmare for some people.
Yeah. It's definitely my stumbling. I mean, I've never had to think about this in terms of returning to work and all of that. But anytime I've thought about giving a bottle to either of my children, the idea of getting the timing right, or not kind of causing an oversupply, or having to chill it in the right way and for the right amount of time, just
Yeah.
blows my mind, and I don't have the headspace for it. So I mean, I completely, like, hats off to any mum who does kind of expressing, or full time. I mean, those who do it full time and,
Yeah,
for
it's a
whatever
massive
reason,
amount of work. It's so
incredible.
much more work than just breastfeeding to be doing a lot of expressing. So
Yeah,
it's very
yeah,
admirable for people that manage to do it.
yeah, amazing. So that's really useful to know. So I guess, I mean, factors there are, how well is the baby eating, but potentially, like, eating, so you're talking about eating solids, aren't you? So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
so potentially might not need to do any expressing. So would you then, like, would they need like a backup, something like a backup formula, or would you just say, like, if you're eating fine, you can probably, and drinking enough
Yeah,
water? So
maybe not. It depends on lots
yeah.
of things. It also depends on the mum's breast milk storage
Mm,
capacity and the baby's your usual feeding habits. And yes, that's another element of it. Many people, by the time that their baby's going to daycare or they're starting work, many people are using some formula anyway.
mm,
So
mm,
it depends on the family's goals, really, where they want to
mm,
really maximize the amount of breast milk going in, or if they're happy to like use formula on daycare and then breastfeed when they're together.
mm,
And do you know yourself that some babies eat so much better than other babies? Some babies don't barely eat a thing until after
mm.
they're 1 year old.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. And both of mine were kind of, it was definitely 9 months before they were actually like having a meal, like a single meal
Yeah.
in a day, and definitely closer to 10 or 11 when they were having sort of two meals. Which I think, at the time felt stressful. It was like, should they be having three meals? Should I be offering three meals? But it's, I found it a real stress actually trying to, with the weaning thing, and just, it was so much easier to just pop them on the boob. um,
Yes.
so
So
that's
if they're in a sort of daycare setting where there's lots of other peers eating, then they probably will eat much better than you see at
mm, yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess the answer to the question is, like, what's the best way? Like, should you kind of drop daytime feeds altogether, or should you, kind of just feed as you normally are on home days, but not on work days? I guess that the answer to that is just, it's very individual, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And in general, I'd say don't ruin the end of your maternity leave fretting about
Mm,
preparing for
mm,
the
okay.
next stage. Because I know a lot of people start thinking, oh, so in a few months I'm going to start work, therefore I should start, weaning the breastfeeding down and changing the sleep routine so it suits the daycare. Or I would just say, don't worry, it will happen when it happens.
Yeah, it clicks into
Uh,
place. Yeah.
yes, and yeah, the basics is that many mothers will not need to pump.
That's really helpful, isn't it? So say you're in that scenario where you're going back to work, say 3 days a week, and you want to continue breastfeeding. What, like, but you're not sure whether you want to drop the daytime feeds, or whether you want to kind of sort of keep
I would
going as you
just
are
keep
on.
feeding. I'd feed as normal when you're together with your baby.
Yeah,
I
okay.
mean, obviously, it depends on the family's goals. And if your baby's quite young as well, like if you go back when they're 4 months or 5 months or 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, probably you need to start with quite a lot of pumping at the times that
Hmm.
you're separated.
Okay.
But it changes quite quickly. Like it might seem really enormous to go to work knowing that you're going to have to take 20 minutes or half an hour, something like every 3 or 4 hours. I'm not saying everybody has to do this, but for instance, some mums will find that's what they need to do to maintain their breast milk supply. And that might seem like a lot. But if you think of it as being like just for 8 weeks and then you can halve that, or it's
Mm.
going to really,
Yeah.
the time will go fast, especially if you're doing a staggered return, as many people are, and you look at actually how many days you're going to have to do that. It's not that much, and it very quickly turns into, I think there's some quite robust evidence saying that the average mum who pumps at work spends about 45 minutes a day or something like that
Oh
pumping.
wow.
Not
Okay.
actually
Yeah.
that much time out of your day. And also, depending what work you do, some people are able to pump and do some element of their work at the same time. Like if they're just typing or something, they might be happy
Mm.
to do that.
Yeah. And I think that is probably a really key point there, is that whatever it is, it's not forever. Like it is going
No,
to, it's going to slow down. It's going to eventually get to a point where you're not having to think about it at work, and then, you know, business
this
as
is
normal
true
at
of many
home.
elements of motherhood, isn't it? Is that it's something that's
Absolutely.
going to be super intense for a while, but get you to your goal
Yeah.
and quickly
And when
improve.
you're in it, it feels like forever. I mean, I remember, so like in the early newborn days, I'd be like, oh my goodness, this one issue I'm having, and someone would be like, be fine, in 6 weeks time you won't even be thinking about this. And be like, 6 weeks feels a long time.
Yeah, I know. I always say when I meet, I do so many home visits with brand new babies, and people say, either how long are you meant to breastfeed for? And then
Yeah.
I don't even dare open my mouth and say 2 years and beyond. What? You have to caveat that conversation very carefully. Or the other question is like, how long does it take to establish breastfeeding? Which I also don't really have an answer for,
Yeah.
but I might share that many families find it gets much better by 8 or 12 weeks. But as you say, that sounds like forever when you're struggling
Yeah.
with a newborn, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So let's talk about the kind of issues that you might face when you kind of return to work and you're breastfeeding. So let's maybe go start with the physical ones, like actual sort of physical issues like engorgement and so on. What are the considerations there?
So yeah, I always give people the heads up about mastitis. So it basically, yes, if you don't keep, well, I'll phrase it differently. When we have changes in our milk supply, when we have changes in our feeding pattern, such as when babies start sleeping through the night, or where we have a rare half day where we're too busy and we're not with our baby, or when we start using childcare, that's when you're really quite prone to getting mastitis. And I always share with families, like, what is the first signs of mastitis? Because
Mm.
I don't know if did you ever have mastitis?
I've been so lucky.
Oh, you dodged a bullet. Well done. I have had mastitis, and it was one of the illest I ever felt.
Oh,
And I think it's really easy to do that most of the time. If somebody breaks out in a full-blown mastitis where they feel feverish and shivery and like they've got flu and so on, you can almost always unpick what happened and think back to a couple of days before, and they'll
mm,
say, oh yeah, I was really run down and really busy, or wearing a really unsuitable bra, or there's something. So it's always worth keeping in mind the very first signs. And then I share some information as well about, this is very nerdy niche comments, but maybe you know that the ABM protocol for mastitis treatment has only changed 2 years ago, and it's completely flipped the guidance on its head. Yeah. So when people Google it, or maybe if they ask their GP or something who might not be up to date, then they can often get the wrong
mm,
information. So I share information about engorgement and about mastitis, and very importantly, hoping that people understand that it can generally be treated at home, and you feel much better within like 24 or 48 hours with the right up-to-date treatment.
mm.
Because I think a lot of people, when they have first or second signs of mastitis, then they just call their GP and they end up getting sent antibiotics, which isn't always the most useful way to treat it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up actually about the mastitis change in guidelines, because yeah, it is, I think it's one of those things that all of us in the breastfeeding world know about. Um but yeah, and a lot of people get advice, or kind of the first kind of port of call from friends, or people, I mean even on Facebook groups, and I often see that the suggestions outdated, and think, oh my goodness, this is, yeah, um,
Yeah, it's
poor
challenging
advice.
because like, it's only recent, and some people might have had their first treatment with their previous child.
Yeah.
or the first advice with their previous child. Another extra tricky thing about that is that I do think that that old guidance sort of works. We now know that maybe we know more about the actual physiology of the breast, which has led to new evidence, which helps us find a better way. But, you know, I had mastitis and I used the old treatment. I remember discussing this with a bunch of colleagues of mine who are also lactation professionals. And many of us said that we remember the old treatment. We feel like the old treatment works. So it's not necessarily wrong, but we now know it's not the most optimal. But that, I think, is another element of how it's been just so hard to get it to filter down to be understood as the current optimal option.
Yeah, got it. Well, I might share the kind of updated guidance just for anyone who might want to follow that up in the show notes. So then let's talk about the emotional side of things, because that's huge. And you mentioned the hormonal aspects. I guess they're linked, aren't they?
Yeah, but my understanding is that we don't have good research about that. It's more something anecdotal, although it kind of makes sense if you think about it. And well, we know from the work of Dr. Amy Brown that the vast majority of people in the UK who stopped breastfeeding at a time that they didn't feel ready. It's like a decision's been taken from them because they're struggling to do it or something. So that's a part of it, isn't it? And then I suppose if you stop breastfeeding due to typical, you know, common logistical kind of reasons like illness of the child or illness of the mother or returning to work or starting to use childcare, then those are all times in your life where you're probably prone to a bit of a hormonal dip anyway. You might be extra tired or extra stressed or have a lot on your plate or suddenly getting less sleep than usual or something like that. So it's quite hard to unpick.
Yeah. And I think that the biggest thing I think is because motherhood is so undervalued anyway in society, and breastfeeding is considered, maybe for, great, but it stops at a certain time and you shouldn't be doing it after a certain age, or it's inappropriate to be doing it, for a long time or in public, or all of these things, all of these ideas around breastfeeding and what should and shouldn't happen, I think must play into that as well, of like, well, I'm going back to work, so I should be stopping breastfeeding, but I don't want to. It doesn't feel right. It's such a great experience for me and my child, but everyone says I should be, and everyone else seems to be coping okay. So what's wrong with me?
I know, I've heard that too, that mums say there's that just ridiculous paradox where everybody's like, you must, you must, you must. And then you reach like 6 months or something and get a complete opposite reaction from everybody like, oh, still, but don't they have teeth? And I suppose, I mean, with all these things, and the hormonal dip too, there's not really a solution or a right answer, is there? I suppose it's helpful to give people the heads up to look out for that. And whenever we're struggling with emotions, it's always helpful to take time to reflect upon it. It's true of hormonal things as well, isn't it? I know you do a lot of work around this, but you know, sometimes you can be so annoyed or so exhausted or so low energy or something. And if you can even if you don't have a solution, if you can think in your mind, oh, hold on,
Yeah.
probably this is my hormones.
Yeah. Half the
That layer
time,
of
just
understanding.
exactly. Half the time, you don't have to change anything. It's just acknowledging that actually
Yeah.
it's okay to feel like this, and there could be a biological, physiological reason. And just that can help. And again, just feeling part of a community of other mums who have felt the same, do feel the same, which is where that kind of being in a breastfeeding group can make such a big difference, can't it? Because you have the space to speak honestly with other mums who may be going through the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so you get the heads up as well because you see the slightly older babies and the transitions that they go through. So you can see what's going to come next.
Yeah, so helpful. That's kind of the original village, I think, that people so desperately need. So this next question is not necessarily just about those who are breastfeeding, but generally about returning to work when you're not
Yeah.
getting very much sleep. Because this is a question I get a lot, is like, how am I going to get back to work, perform as I used to pre-baby, but I'm getting, maybe 5, 6 broken hours of sleep. What do I do? What's your key advice there?
Oh, that's such a tricky one. Well, lower your standards. Maybe something about like just adjusting our expectations and lowering your standards. Myself, I'd be a big fan of co-sleeping, but I don't know if
Mm,
that doesn't work for everybody. Some people find that they can't relax and sleep with their baby or toddler in their bed, or that they just feel more disrupted by the wiggling. But it can be, especially for breastfeeding families, it can be quite a good way to continue the breastfeeding,
mm,
or even just laying down breastfeeding, or
mm.
having your baby or toddler in a bed that's big enough that you can lie down with them, maybe a single mattress on the floor or something. So there's an option,
Mm.
even if they're not in your bed. I'm a big fan of lying down breastfeeding, like
Yeah.
99% asleep while breastfeeding. That's a good one. Yeah, adjusting expectations. It depends on the routine, but it is quite well proven that if your baby goes to bed later and you can align your first chunk of sleep, you feel much better. Something about deeper sleep and lighter sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and non-REM sleep, that if you get, I don't know what your babies did, but the first chunk of sleep is often the longest
Mm.
for babies. And then they might wake after 4, 5, 6 hours, and then it starts becoming, sometimes it's every hour, every 45 minutes or something
Yeah.
in the early hours of the morning, isn't it? And you're just lying
Yeah.
there thinking, are we pretending it's still nighttime? And so that's quite valuable. I think, I don't know if it's like, it's an English thing, isn't it? And lots of baby routine books that we believe that babies should go to bed at 7 and wake up at
Mm.
7. But I don't think that's proven as typical at all.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
can get them to go to bed at 9 or 10 and you're happy to lay down then, you can both get like that longer chunk and you won't be interrupted when you're in your deeper sleep cycle. And that can be being woken from a lighter sleep cycle is much less offensive.
Less disruptive. Yeah, that's really interesting advice actually. Because I was going to say, because reverse cycling is a bit of an issue as well, isn't it? If you've been away
Yeah,
for quite a big chunk of the day, they tend to try and sort of make up for it, or can sometimes make up for it at night time.
yeah.
So your sleep is even more disrupted.
I know it's a horrible twist of fate that, yeah,
Yeah.
just at the time where you need your sleep most,
Yeah.
your baby's likely to do reverse cycling.
Yeah.
And we don't really know if that's about like the nutrition or the connection or the immunity or the calories, but it does seem that they just, yeah, they often, improved sleep just gets worse. Although I
Yeah.
think that's a non-breastfeeding thing as well, isn't it? I guess it depends on their age, but I think it's quite well proven that many babies sleep better when they're sort of 8 or 9 weeks old than
Mm.
they do when they're 7 months old.
Which is such a shock, isn't it, for so many?
Well, it's good to know though as well, because otherwise I think people think that they've broken their baby or
Yeah.
that they've made a mistake, or, oh, I shouldn't have fed them when they woke, now they're doing it all the time or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Getting into the whole, like, making a rod for your back thing. Yeah. And again, that comes back down to being part of a community of people who have that experience, or can have a moan about that, and that start to understand that it is just completely normal and
Yeah, and
common.
maybe the community comes in again with accepting help, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you can
Yeah.
get some, I mean, if you can afford it and you can get some hours from your cleaner or use a laundry service or
Yeah.
something, or if you've got a friend or a neighbour that might take your kid for a Saturday afternoon and you take theirs the next time, or just
Yeah.
whatever you can do to
Yeah.
get
No.
through that intense period and accept help. And yeah, like I said, lower your expectations.
Yeah. And I think that is so key, just going back to the sleep thing where you said not making too many changes, because again, it could be one of those things where you're like, right, I've got to get them into their own cot, sleeping through the night before I get to work because I need to have that unbroken sleep. And then
Yeah.
when you realize that actually they're going to be more awake because they want to reconnect or feed or whatever it is, the reason for that, can really knock you, because you think, but they were fine, they were sleeping through and all of that, and now it's kind of gone to pot. And again, it's like, what have I done wrong? So I
Yeah, I
think
always
that,
share that as well with parents. If they're Parents often ask me about sleep things, and if anyone's considering on doing actual sleep, something like sleep training, like deliberately trying to edit and adjust their child's sleep habits, especially at night and with night wakes or night weaning, it's always worth thinking about what's coming up, because
mm,
if you do anything that's quite like controlled at night and trying to really reorganize their sleep patterns, as soon as you have a holiday or a babysitter or another big change or a growth spurt, then you basically, many families find that they have to do it all over again. And if that's upsetting at all or stressful or exhausting, then it's worth weighing up whether it's the right time, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's really useful. Well, thank you so much. I think this has been so interesting. We've covered so much, and I really think it's going to be one of those episodes that will be really helpful to a lot of mums listening. So how can people learn more about you and find you online if they want to start following you?
So my company is baby-thrive.com. And I have various offerings. The vast majority of my work is cycling around Southeast and Central London, going to visit new families when their babies have just been born. They just pay me directly and I go and sit with them and help them make a plan and improve their breastfeeding experience. But I've also got a breastfeeding cafe in Crystal Palace, which is free or donation, in Southeast London, I should say, for those who are not locals and don't know where Crystal Palace is. And I'm doing online groups. I'm doing antenatals, and there's also details on my website of the return to work online group and return to work one-to-ones, where we can sit down and really like make a bespoke plan of what works. So the prices are from like, for all those things, it goes from free to donation to £25 to £80 to £190. There's lots of different choices in there. What suits you?
Yeah, great. That's amazing. And it's great that it's so accessible to lots of different people. Well, thank you so much. I'll put all of those links up on the show notes so people can follow up and hopefully get the help that they need if they are at that stage of returning to work.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Take care.